Hi everybody, my name is Mitchell Farmer and today we'll be discussing Laboratory 2 of the Head and Neck series, talking about the neck. So first I wanted to get us started with the boundaries of the neck, beginning with the superior boundaries. So superiorly and anteriorly, anterior, posterior, we have the mandible. So we can start in the midline and it follows along the body of the mandible, the angle of the mandible, and then the ramus of the mandible. You can then follow it posteriorly along the inferior aspect of the temporal bone, and then all the way back around until we've reached the occipital protuberance of the occipital bone. So if I click on this multicolor mode, and I rotate us so we're looking at a posterior view of the occipital bone, this area right here is the occipital protuberance. I'll exit out of that. So you can follow around to the occipital protuberance, then you can follow it back around to the mentis and down like this, and that is the superior boundaries of the neck. The inferior boundaries begin at the suprasternal notch right here. So if I go into multicolor mode and we show you the superior boundary of the manubrium, this is the jugular or suprasternal notch. I exit out. So it starts there, and then as we move laterally, it becomes the clavicle. And we follow the whole way along the clavicle all the way to the acromion process. And then if we draw an imaginary line from the acromion process all the way to what is known as the vertebra prominens. And that's because this is the palpable vertebrae in your back of C7. So right here. So if you drew an imaginary line from suprasternal area to C7 and then all the way to the other one, that would be the inferior boundary of the neck along with the clavicles and the suprasternal notch. All right, so now I'm just going to briefly discuss some osteology, starting with the mandible. So the mandible has a whole bunch of osteology, but the three general things I'm going to discuss is you have the body, which is this purple horseshoe-like object here, wrapping from one side to the other. The body continue with the ramus of the mandible, and then most superiorly we have the mandibular condyle, and then this area right here is known as the mandibular angle. We also have the hyoid, which is going to be a very important landmark for the rest of the lab. It doesn't have any bony articulations. I've already shown you the occipital protuberance, but what I did want to show you inferior to that is the atlas and the axis, because these two vertebrae don't look like any other vertebrae in the whole spinal column. They're kind of unique. The atlas has no body or spinous process, and it articulates with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone superiorly. So if I go to the occipital bone, and I pull up our multicolor mode, and take us to a posterior view, the inferior most like dark bluish gray area here, those are the occipital condyles, and that's what the atlas articulates with superiorly. You can kind of see it right here. And then inferiorly, we have the axis. And the notable thing about the axis is it has something known as the odontoid process, or the dens, and that's this lime green object right here. And that extends upwards from the body to articulate with the anterior arch of the atlas. And then finally, like I already mentioned, we also have the vertebra prominens right here, the spinous process of C7. Now, before I continue on with the laboratory proper, I just wanted to mention something about neck anatomy in general. So it's very complicated, and everything is wrapped in fascia. And this model doesn't really do fascia well, so I suggest that you look up in an atlas how exactly all the fascial layers wrap everything. And this can also be challenging in the cadaveric dissection to dig through all these fascial layers, so I really suggest you kind of just look it up in an anatomy atlas to get a better idea, especially before going into the lab. Alright, so on to the laboratory proper. So the way that we divide the neck is we divide it into a series of triangles. There's two large triangles known as the posterior and anterior triangle. I'm going to start us off with the posterior triangle, and these triangles are just used as a means to organize the anatomy of the neck. So the posterior triangle is easy. We have its posterior boundary is the trapezius muscle highlighted here. Recall this is what the trapezius looks like. So we have the trapezius muscle right there. And that's its posterior boundary. Its superior or its anterior boundary, anterior superior really, is the sternocleidomastoid. And then its inferior boundary is the clavicle. And so it doesn't really take a stretch of imagination to draw yourself a triangle. You got your clavicle, and then up along the trapezius, and then down along the sternocleidomastoid. So this area, this is the posterior triangle right here. One of two triangles of the neck. The anterior triangle has its posterior boundary is the sternocleidomastoid. Its superior boundary is the body of the mandible, highlighted here. And its anterior boundary is just the midline of the neck. So this takes a bit more imagination, but you can kind of see, go along the body of the mandible, the midline of the neck, then along the sternocleidomastoid, you could get the anterior triangle. Now, that doesn't seem so bad, really. But the problem is that the anterior triangle is split into 4 more triangles. And those 4 triangles are organized in a series of 2 groups. And I'm going to go over those right now. So we have the suprahyoid group and the infrahyoid group. Pretty easy. Suprahyoid is above the hyoid. It includes the muscle groups, and the groups are based on muscles. So it includes the mylohyoid, the stylohyoid, the posterior belly of the digastric, and the anterior belly of the digastric. And so these guys are all, or many of them are involved in lifting the hyoid superiorly. And then infrahyoid below the hyoid, and that includes the sternohyoid, the thyrohyoid, as well as the omohyoid, highlighted here. So you can split the anterior into that suprahyoid and infrahyoid, and then we can further split the suprahyoid into a series of 2 triangles. So there is the digastric or submandibular triangle. The digastric triangle, I'm going to call it the digastric triangle, but it also goes by submandibular. The digastric triangle has the boundaries of the stylohyoid is its posterior boundary, or the anterior belly of the digastric. Its anterior boundary is the digastric, the anterior belly of the digastric. And its base is the mandible. And then the other triangle that we can split into here is the submental. The submental, its base is the hyoid, or its posterior boundary is the hyoid. Sorry, its base is the midline, its posterior boundary is the hyoid. And then its superior boundary is the anterior belly of the digastric. So this is the anterior belly, and then this is the posterior belly, and that's divided by the stylohyoid. I should have mentioned that first. And then, so I guess just to make that super easy for you and draw it out, I'm just going to pull up my little drawing tool here. We can go the stylohyoid. Okay. So the stylohyoid, and then the anterior belly of the digastric, and then the mandible. So this would be the digastric triangle. And then for the submental triangle, we can go the hyoid is in our inferior, and then the midline, and then the anterior belly of the digastric. And this is the submental. So those are 2 of our triangles, and that's the suprahyoid group. The infrahyoid group can be split into another 2 triangles. We're going to have the carotid triangle, which is going to be here, and I'll tell you the boundaries in a second. And then we're going to have the muscular triangle, which is going to extend down the midline and kind of look like that. So that's going to be carotid and muscular. There's going to be 4 triangles here at the end. Kind of confusing, but what do? Basically, for the infrahyoid group, we have, as I said before, the carotid triangle, which its anterior border is stylohyoid. Its inferior border is the sternocleidomastoid, and its superior border is the digastric posterior belly, as well as the stylohyoid. So posterior belly, anterior belly. And so you can see the triangle right there. And then finally, the muscular triangle has the omohyoid as the anterior boundary. And then it has the base of it is the midline, just imagine an imaginary line here. And then its posterior boundary is the sternocleidomastoid. And then you get another triangle. Okay? So hopefully that wasn't too confusing. It is kind of difficult to show on a model, so I do recommend looking it up in an atlas and it'll become clear very quickly. Now I'm just going to discuss very quickly some of the contents of those triangles before wrapping up part 1 of this head and neck series. So I'm going to discuss the posterior anatomy of the neck in part 2. But as far as the anterior cervical triangle goes, including the digastric, I'm going to pull up another thing really quick here, so that I can show you some of the contents of the digastric triangle. All right. So here's some stuff added. Recall that the digastric triangle is between the stylohyoid, the anterior belly of the digastric, and the body of the mandible, this triangle here. And so it's easy to see that it possesses, or it contains, the facial vein, the facial artery, the submental vein, as well as part of the lingual vein. And then you can see what's difficult to see here is that it also contains the submandibular lymph nodes and submandibular gland. So let's say I add in the lymph nodes here. You can see that it does contain some of the submandibular lymph nodes within that triangle as well. And then deep to it is some of the mylohyoid muscle as well. And then along its posterior border, it has the two divisions of the hypoglossal nerve. So the hypoglossal nerve is in the carotid triangle, but 2 of its divisions, the branches to the intrinsic and extrinsic muscles of the tongue, are within the digastric triangle. And then more simply, you have the submental triangle, which doesn't really contain much. All it contains is the submental nodes, and then at its base is the mylohyoid muscle, which is the floor of the oral cavity. And I'm going to bring up another image here real quick for us. So the carotid triangle contains quite a lot. Anterior boundary is the omohyoid, inferior boundary is the sternocleidomastoid, superior boundary is the digastric, as well as the small bit of the stylohyoid here. It contains, unsurprisingly, the common carotid, which is within something known as the carotid sheath. So the carotid sheath contains the common carotid, the internal carotid, and the other bifurcation, the external carotid, as well as the internal jugular and the vagus nerve. So those are all within those 5 objects: the bifurcation, the common carotid, the internal jugular, and the vagus, all within the carotid sheath. In the cadaveric dissection, there'll be a fascial layer present, but there's no fascia in this model, so it's not there. And then the muscular triangle doesn't contain too much. It just contains a few muscles, which I'm not going to go over right now. Okay? So hopefully that wasn't too confusing for you. Neck anatomy is pretty difficult, and it'll take a while to get a grasp of, but for now, just try and focus on the basic anatomy of the triangles and like the very large structures that are within them. I will see you for part 2, where I'm going to discuss the posterior anatomy of the neck. I'm going to discuss more infrahyoid anatomy, and I'm also going to discuss the anatomy of the root of the neck.